Why am I showcasing the Vortex Reticle 3-18 in this GLX video? Well, it's very simple. I had these two scopes at the exact same time, and I filmed and reviewed and tested them at the exact same time. But it's been like 8 months since the Strike Eagle was released, so I'm a little behind the 8 ball on this one. However, the Primary Arms GLX 3-18x44, as seen here, is a pretty sweet sounding scope, at least on paper. It's got all of the usual GLX tropes. It's made in the Philippines. As you'll see, it has amazing controls and layouts, and it comes in at a fairly acceptable price, around $800. The Strike Eagle comes in around the same price as Nears, makes no difference, but that is made in China. If you want to buy a Primary Arms product, but you don't want to spend the $800 on this, the SLXs are about half the price. Inside the box is the usual suite of Primary Arms goodies, as well as a very well illustrated instruction manual. As far as the scope as a whole, it is wonderfully proportioned. It looks absolutely fantastic, and on my scale, it comes in at a pretty good weight of around 30 ounces, 7/10 or so. Comparing that to the Strike Eagle 3-18, that does come in a little bit lighter, but only by about 3.7 ounces. For many of you, that's going to be an immediate deal breaker. For others, not so much. The last comparison is going to be with my Optica 6 3-18x50 in my GG&G mount. Comes in at 38 ounces, but subtract the mount and you get exactly 30 ounces. So as near as makes no difference, the exact same as the GLX. One notable thing to talk about with the GLXs are all of their touch points. They are unique to them from the SLXs and the PLXs from Primary Arms. They have a lot of rubberized coatings, which aren't everyone's cup of tea. However, they do serve a good purpose. The Fast Focus eyepiece has that same rubberized texture, and it really does allow for a pretty good firm grip on it without being too grippy or too texturized. The eyepiece is extremely tight though, and it feels absolutely wonderful. There's nothing I could really change about it. Once you get it locked in the right position, the seals tighten up, and you don't have to worry about it coming loose. As for the magnification ring, it's 180 degrees, a standard throw, and the throw lever that we see here originally came out on the PLXC 1-8. They've started to bring that DNA from that optic into their lower tier scopes, and I'm very happy to see that because the throw lever, little cattail thingamabob, is excellent. It's a good size. You can get, I believe you can get longer ones, don't quote me, but I really don't think you'd need it. I think it would just more or less get in the way. The cattail makes turning the magnification ring extremely easy, and because it's not a bolt-on add-on product, it's not going to make the magnification ring gigantic. But speaking of gigantic, it's going to be the illumination ring that is abnormally large, but there's a reason for that. There are 10 positions with offs in between, and it does feel quite good. Detent on it is I would say it's intermediate. It's not as shallow as a lot, but it's not as deep as some, but it has a good, solid, positive click to it. Removing the battery compartment cover, you can see that the cap itself is very large. That is because there is room for a spare CR2032 battery in there. This is one of the very few scopes that I can think of that has room built into itself specifically to house a spare battery for your illumination. I think it's an absolutely wonderful little detail that Primary Arms threw into the scope, and I really would like to see that on other options as well, because how often do you really have to wonder where you have a CR2032 battery lying around? Removing the battery from the compartment, you could see we have a very unique looking PCB board down there. Only 4 springs, good positive spring in the middle. Battery locks in there nice and tight though. In fact, it's actually a little bit more challenging on this setup than a more traditional 6 or 8 prong battery compartment, but it works extremely well. As far as the parallax knob, just shy of 270 degrees from minimum to maximum. Minimum is 25 meters, and as you can probably guess, it's extremely hard to turn. This scope was brand new. One of my viewers bought it and sent it to me for me to review before he even took it out of the box and played with it. So this is factory fresh from a reviewer, not from Primary Arms. Not that that would really make a difference, but for some people out there, they don't want me getting scopes for free from companies, and I can understand that. 100% I can understand that. But I don't hold my punches. And so far with this GLX, there's nothing to hold my punches about, especially when it comes to the turrets. Very similar to what you find on a lot of loopholed products. You have a push button on both the windage and the elevation that disengages the lock. From the 0 on both turrets, they are locked. So to unlock them, you have to push the button and turn. Once you turn it a little bit, you can continue turning until you bring it back down to your 0. It's a wonderful system. I really like it. For some people, they're going to prefer a standard style lock where you have to lift up on the turret or push down. But I feel there's a really strong case to where these can be superior in a lot of ways. Specifically when you don't know where your 0 is, instead of constantly turning it and hoping that you're going to hit your 0 stop, it'll just lock in and you'll know for sure you're at 0. Anyway, before we take a much closer look at these turrets, overall, physically, this thing is wonderful. Just like every other GLX I've ever got my hands on, or for that matter, most other Filipino-made scopes, it's got a better quality feel to it. The finishes are nicer, the controls are nicer, the materials are nicer, and it just feels nicer in hand, especially when compared to the Strike Eagle. This feels like a much more substantial scope, but let's see how well it performs. I've never experienced it with loopholes or the Night Forces of actually being able to go past the 0 lock, but unfortunately on this one it happened numerous times. There's also a little bit of play to the turret when you start twisting it side to side, taking the slop in the erector, but other than that, it's a very good sounding and feeling turret. As far as the reticle, as seen here, this is one of several different options that you can get from Primary Arms. This one is the Apollo 308/65 Creedmoor. This is set up more or less for drops for those two cartridges at varying distances and wind holds. Me personally, I'm not a fan of BDCs in anything larger than an LPVO. I really feel that you could extract a lot more precision using a standard milling reticle and understanding your dope and your adjustments. Another thing I'm not the biggest fan of on some Primary Arms stuff is the use of chevrons. Chevrons for fast-paced stuff, LPVOs, sure, no problem. But for precision work, I really prefer a small fine dot. As you can very clearly tell, the center of this reticle is very weak. You have the chevron and the small little tick marks going out to about 2 mils on the windage and up to the first drop on the elevation. And it just doesn't attract me. It doesn't really seem to impress me all that much. I'm sure for a lot of people it'll be great, specifically for people that are probably going to be using this as a quote-unquote hunting setup, because it won't obscure too much of your target around the chevron. Again, different strokes for different folks. I think a 3-18 like this that weighs 30 ounces would be better suited on a tactical setup, and at that point, I'd much prefer a different style of reticle. I'm going to jump right into some negatives. And the first negative, and in fact, the biggest negative, the only real negative, is just how insanely tight and useless this eye box is. At 18x, it is so close to just being unusable that it's frustrating. Even bringing it down a considerable amount, those shadows creep up so ridiculously fast. And the image stability on this thing isn't the greatest either. In fact, when I bring it back even further, instead of having a crescent moon-shaped shadow that is progressive, it's like you flip a switch and a wall just comes over from one side. I love everything about this scope physically, but unfortunately my short time with it was not one of great pleasure and joy. Let's see if this thing can track at least halfway decently. As you can very clearly see, the reticle does not shift on the target when we decrease or increase magnification, and jockeying around the side parallax, it does not seem like it shifts it over significantly. The illumination on this scope, however, is quite good for what it is, and better than most. Because this is not a milling reticle, with the exception of the windage, you could see the windage marks line up basically perfectly to my target. The rest of the drops on the elevation are not going to do anything, so we're specifically focusing on the center chevron. The image does get a little dark, but I was having some lighting issues this day. But you could see across 10 mils of elevation, there is zero shift, and there is no slop to the windage or the elevation turrets. Tracking-wise, this thing passes with a perfect performance. I would really love to see how this would handle a regular style milling reticle, especially considering just how well it lines up on the windage. See, tell me this is an old video without telling me this is an old video. Well, you're looking at my old 30-yard power transformer. It was about a year and a half ago. Yeah, about a year and a half ago, I got my hands on the scope and I started filming with this, as well as the Strike Eagle that we took a really brief look at earlier on in the video. That's going to showcase itself very soon, but until then, let's just admire the 3X on this thing. It's actually pretty decent. The center part of the reticle is a little bit harder to pick up, but it's not impossible. I do think that it's a fairly decent reticle as far as scaling goes and being usable at the minimum and the maximum magnification. Again, I'm not the biggest fan of the drops, but everything else seems okay. But the most important bit, which is the center and the drops, are just, I don't know whose cup of tea they're going to be, but it's definitely not mine. Image quality is very capable at either end of the magnification range. At its maximum here at 30 yards, you can see that we can focus on that American flag very well, and there's nothing really negative to say about it. There was no sharpness issues, there was no clarity issues, it was quite good. There also didn't appear to be that much chromatic aberration, but it was a very bright sunny day when I filmed this, and sometimes I've found that chromatic aberration really starts to creep in when you have more muted light, like overcast, let's say. Anyway, let's focus now on our 400-ish yard brick building and slowly ramp up the magnification to focus on that air vent. I set the side parallax as close as I could to the distance that we were looking at, just to see how well it actually lines up, and it's not bad. It's actually very close, but you can see the trees in the foreground are a little bit more focused than what that brick wall looks like. So a real quick twist of the side parallax knob, and it yields a much better result. It was a very minor difference that was there, so it's not like I had to jockey around and try to figure out where the best spot was. So the side parallax knob is very close to what we actually see. With the side parallax dialed in as good as we can get it, this is a very good looking image. Again, no chromatic aberration to speak of. The trees in the background and the foreground are pretty much perfectly in focused, even though our parallax is set perfectly for the brick building. So it's got a pretty good depth of field. The view through it's also quite large. Not the biggest, but definitely not the smallest. And the border or the scope body that we see is also on the minimal side. Contrast is good. Colors are good. Vibrancy to the image is good. There's not much I could really criticize about this image performance here at 400 yards. And that's what's so ridiculously frustrating about the scope for me. You see, dear viewer, when you are perfectly behind the scope, it is going to wow you. It's going to give you such a wonderful experience of how good an optic can look. But the second you go slightly off-center at any magnification, you just start getting nauseous. The image just flip-flops. It goes from beautiful to just smeared with grease. And it's not just at the higher magnifications. It's at every magnification. And the shadows creep up so fast at all different magnifications that if you don't have an absolutely perfect cheek weld behind the scope, you're going to have a very challenging time using it. I was going to save it for the side-by-side with the Strike Eagle, but the Strike Eagle, albeit is still pretty tight, it's still significantly more enjoyable to use as opposed to the GLX. I really didn't like my time behind the GLX. I had it for a couple of weeks. I shot with it a couple of times. And every time that I got behind it, I wanted it to be better. The glass performance is very good, but the eye-box performance is just flat out off. And it really, really disappoints me. I partly wonder if that's because this is a 6x multiplier, very similar, of course, to the GLX 1:6 first focal plane, where it just seemed horrible. This just has that same air of just blah. However, for a lot of people, maybe even yourself included, you're not going to really care or mind that too much. Maybe you don't even notice it. Me, I'm a bit jaded having the experience that I have behind so many scopes that if something's not exactly where it should be, I'm disappointed. But this is still an $800 scope. It's a lot of money. You can get into some budget Japanese scopes that are going to perform a little bit better than this and probably just be a little bit better scope overall. Granted, I still love how good this thing feels in hand, and I love all the controls. It really is an oddity, especially when we dial up 10 mils at 1,000 yards and the image actually improves. It sharpens up a little bit. It clears up. Those lines are beautiful. But again, if you are not 1,000% behind this thing perfectly, you are not going to be able to enjoy it anywhere near as much. Anyway, I'm definitely getting on this thing a little bit hard, but that's only because it disappointed me so much. Even though it's so close to being really, really good and has a lot of things that I really like, it's still just a little bit off. Illumination, very clearly after dusk, is very good on this thing. It gets bright, it's clear, and it doesn't blossom out and bloom out and destroy the rest of the image with weird reflections. It's a tremendous illumination setup on this scope. One that I'd like to see on more MPVOs and HPVOs, again, simply because it doesn't bloom out and distort the rest of the image. Keeping it in the middle-ish of the illumination setting, I bring it up to its maximum magnification, again at our 400-yard brick building. At this point in time, that image still looks quite good. There is very little loss to brightness to the image, to my eye, that I was able to notice. However, because we have much lower light outside, that just means that the eye box is actually going to get even smaller. So when I start shifting the camera behind the scope again, it's going to go from, wow, that's actually quite a good looking image, to, oh, I can't see anything through this scope. And you best believe that with the naked eye, it's going to be much harder. Again, because as light disappears, our irises get larger, and our irises will actually get larger than what the exit pupil is on most rifle scopes at their higher magnification, which is why you get that weird shadow effect. In these conditions, this thing wasn't usable above 10x to the naked eye. Finally, getting into some side-by-side comparisons. We're going to start out with the Strike Eagle on the right. Both the GLX and the Strike Eagle were filmed at the same time using the same camera settings, albeit with slightly shifting lighting conditions, but nevertheless, the Strike Eagle is a little bit darker to look through as opposed to the GLX. I filmed both these scopes at the exact same time, so they'd be as close to this as possible. It was just by sheer happenstance that someone sent in the GLX to me as I bought the Strike Eagle, and it worked out quite well. Now, in my Strike Eagle video, I did say that the 30-18 is pretty good, but I still prefer the 5-25, and I still stand by those words. However, if you're specifically looking for a 3-18 and looking to be in the $700 to $800-ish price point, then these two are some serious contenders, because the GLX is around $800, the Strike Eagle is around $750. Granted, Philippines versus Chinese. However, one clear thing that we can immediately pick up is just the view looking through these things. The GLX is not small, but it's nowhere near as big as the Strike Eagle. And the Strike Eagle has a much more wow, in-your-face view looking through it, and it's something that a lot of people can appreciate. While I play around getting both these targets focused on both these scopes, as far as the length difference between these two, the GLX is 13.6 inches, the Strike Eagle is only 12. Weight-wise, you already saw it's a little bit lighter than the GLX, and then field of view is actually quite different. 36.7 for the GLX versus 41.8 to 6.1 to 7 feet. That is pretty large. Now, despite the fact that the GLX is very tight in the eye box department, it has a 9.3 to 2.4 millimeter exit pupil versus the Strike Eagle 7.1 to 2.5. So the GLX is a little bit easier on the bottom end, but the Strike Eagle is a little bit easier on the top end. As far as these two images, look at how much larger the depth of field is on the Strike Eagle versus the GLX. Again, pro versus con, depending on who you are. The biggest thing with the Strike Eagle was there was a noticeable color tint to the image. It's got a slight purple hue to it. However, if we were to look beyond just the color tinting and look at these two images side by side as subjective as possible, There's a couple key things that we can really take away here. First off, the Strike Eagle definitely has a darker looking image. You could also see some chromatic aberration on the top of that steel plate at the 9 o'clock position. Contrast wise though, I think I do have to give it to the Strike Eagle. Despite the fact that the GLX is a much brighter, warmer looking image, I do think that we can pick up a little bit more fine detail through the Strike Eagle at this berm. I like showcasing this berm a lot because there's a ton of detail there, and that's really important when it comes to doing any sort of precision shooting or hunting for that matter, because you might have a varmint somewhere out there that's hiding, trying to eat one of your dogs or your cattle, and you know what? If you could see them, it's better than not being able to see them. I'll just leave it like that. Anyway, let's focus on a more consistent target out at 200 yards, this giant shoot and see with several bullet holes in it, and see which one comes out on top. Skipping right on through dialing the side focus, both of these look quite good. In fact, I think we're splitting hairs here as opposed to where we just were. Depth of field at greater distances is going to matter less and less, and here at 200 yards, even though the bushes behind those targets are only about 10 to 15 yards away, you really can't tell a difference between these two. But the brightness definitely starts to add up. Look at the backer on these two targets. The GLX is significantly brighter looking than the Strike Eagle. One thing that I definitely noticed with the Strike Eagle was, despite the fact that it had a good image and it was fairly stable, it just didn't pop anywhere near as much as the GLX. And that's going to be important when you start getting into areas like this. Very heavy, dense brush over a target. Because with the GLX, you can very clearly see what's behind the target. With the Strike Eagle, nowhere near as much. So despite the fact that these two scopes are very similar to one another, there are a certain amount of pros and cons that we have to take into consideration and weigh out for our options. Overall, physically, the GLX I think is a superior scope, but the Strike Eagle is a little bit easier to understand and set up. It's got a capped windage and a more traditional style lock to the elevation. Which one of these would I buy? Because these things are actually quite expensive, I don't think I'd buy any of them. I think I'd rather buy any of the other scopes we're about to look at. And the first one's going to be the Primary Arms SLX 3-18 by 50 in the first focal plane. This is about $500. It's the exact same length as the GLX. It's about 2 ounces heavier than the GLX. Not the biggest problem or the end of the world. As far as our overall field of view down range, you got 36.7 to 35, so the SLX is actually a little bit smaller. And on the top end, we see a similar trend, 6.1 with the GLX to 5.9 with the SLX. Exit pupil wise, again, it goes to the GLX at the minimum, but on the maximum, the SLX is a whopping 2.8 millimeter versus 2.4. That makes getting behind the SLX at higher magnifications much easier. And my experience with the SLX was much greater than that with the GLX. Now, the SLX does not have any locks to either of the turrets, so that is something that you must take into consideration. Is that going to be a deal breaker for you? Also, with the SLX, you could see we have a more standard milling reticle, but the center is still just about the same as what we see with GLX, that tiny chevron and then those tiny little dots off on either side, above it and below it. And it's really frustrating. Yeah, it's just really frustrating. It's annoying. I just wish they had more simpler traditional reticle on there, more precision-oriented stuff. Both of these look quite good, but I would give it to the SLX for being a better-looking optic. It's a little bit closer to what we saw with the Strike Eagle as far as its overall performance. And truth be told, between both of these, I think I'd probably edge towards the SLX if I was building more of a simple, lower-budget precision gun. So the SLX doesn't have locking turrets, and you really want something that has locks, and maybe even better overall controls in certain aspects. Let me introduce you to the Athlon Helos BTR Gen 2 4-20. Now, on the minimum magnification, of course there's going to be a big difference between these two, because it's a 4x versus a 3x. But on the top end, well, the Helos isn't going to have that less of field of view, even though it's got 2x more on the top end. As far as the price, it is around $560. As far as the length, they're about the same. As far as the weight, it's about 2 ounces lighter than the GLX. And Eye relief is the exact same at 3.6 inches. The reticle on the Helos is exactly what a lot of people want in a more precision-oriented scope. You have that fine center dot flanked with a very fine yet still easy to read milling reticle. Athlon did an absolutely wonderful job with the Helos, both the 2-12 and this 4-20. I think that if you're on a more lower budget, mid to high sixes, let's say, you really can't go wrong with the Helos because it's even less expensive than that. At 200 yards, I didn't get the perfect setup for the side parallax, and that's the only reason why this image looks a little bit blurry. If you look at the wind flag at 100 yards at the 6 o'clock position, you can see that's much clearer. And out to 300 yards, I actually noticed it and made my adjustments to this way. The side parallax was perfect. The Helos is just like its little brother, the 2-12, basically perfect for what you are spending your money on. It's got a lot of great features, a lot of good touch points. Materials don't feel as good as the GLX, nor does some of the finishing. However, it's substantially less expensive, and I feel optically it performs much better. Not only as a joy to use it, but a more cohesive package given what a 4-20 is going to be used for. My final comparison is going to be against the Meopta Optica 6. This 3-18 by 50 first focal plane MPVO has been a staple on my channel ever since I first got my hands on it a very long time ago. A few things we can notice right off the bat. The MRAD1 reticle found in the Optica 6 is a much better setup for the entire magnification range. I could harp on that all day long. The view through the Optica 6 is smaller than with the GLX. It's perhaps one of the smallest of this sort of magnification range. We also see a little bit more of the scope body. However, one thing cannot be denied, and that is the sharpness, clarity, and colors of the Optica 6 are wonderful. This is actually a brand new video that I took of the Optica 6 a couple of days ago because I didn't have any good modern take on this optic. So I wanted to do this so I could have it for much more comparable comparisons, if that makes sense. Contrast on the Optica 6 is also a little better, I would say. There's fewer things to notice as far as rocks and debris on the berm, but I think it still has the edge sharpness and clarity-wise over the GLX. As far as some specs, when you can find the Optica 6 on sale, they're about the same price. It's 14.6 inches long versus 13.6 for the GLX. Weight-wise, they're about the same. Field of view is less with the Optica 6 because we have a smaller view looking through it. 33.5 feet to 36.7 and 5.8 to 6.1. But the big thing is going to be the eye relief. The GLX is 3.5 inches. The Optica 6, 3.9 inches. Some people prefer the eye relief to be really short, others really long, somewhere in the average range of between 3 to 3.5 inches. But the Optica 6 is nearly a full half inch farther forward than the GLX, and that's going to help with situational awareness in your peripherals. If I had to choose between these two scopes, it would be hands down the Optica 6. It's something I've had for a long time and will continue to have for a very long time, until maybe Meopta comes out with something a little bit better. But I'm not going to hold my breath for that. There's not a whole lot else I could really say about this scope that I haven't already said. On paper, this thing is wonderful. And on your TV screen or computer screen or your cell phone screen, it looks fantastic. And it does. It really, really does. Yeah, the couple of nitpicks, the reticle is certainly not something I would personally opt for, but even the regular milling one that we saw earlier with the SLX still has the same weird tropes that this reticle has. That chevron in the middle and then the really small dots out to about 2 mils all around it. Just not my cup of tea. The only thing that this thing doesn't do great is the overall experience of looking through it. With a camera perfectly rigid on any sort of conditions, it looks great. But to the naked eye, it was nauseating and jarring. I really can't put my finger on as to why. Maybe the 6x multiplier is just a little bit too much for this glass. Maybe if it was a 3-15, it would be better. Or a 4-20, it would be even better. But I just can't place what really throws this thing off. Other than when you get behind this thing and you use it for any length of time, you're probably going to get a headache, like I did. And I very rarely get headaches when I'm looking through a scope, even for extended periods of time. Now, yes, it is true. This is a serving size of 1. Maybe if I had 2 or even 3 of these, I'd get different results across the board. But the fact still remains that this thing just still performed the way it did. And it's really upsetting. If this had the same exit pupil and eye box setup as most of the other scopes that we looked at, it would be a home run. As you've already seen, it performs extremely well in a myriad of different tests. Tracking is perfect. Its low light performance is quite good, albeit with a very tight eye box at the top magnification. But I challenge you to find any MPVO or HPVO that's going to perform significantly better than how this thing did. Even with 10 mils of added elevation, the image actually got improved some. So yeah, there's a lot of things that we can take away with this scope. Unfortunately, my end user experience on this scope was poor. But I'm very sensitive to distortion in glass. I'm very sensitive to tight eye boxes and poor image stability. If you're not, let's say you don't even know what I'm talking about, you've never experienced it or had a problem with it, maybe you'll be okay with the scope. I'm sure there's a lot of people out there that are happy with this scope. But the individual that sent this to me, when I gave it back to him, he sent it back to Primary Arms and he went with a different scope, because he had very similar experience to what I had with it. So it definitely wasn't just a me thing. Maybe it was just a scope thing. But at the end of the day, I can't test more than 1 or 2 scopes probably ever. It's hard to line up like that. Anyway, a huge thank you to the individual that sent this in. I love getting my hands on stuff like this because this is a very popular setup scope. 3-18 by 44. Good price point. Great control set, great everything, except for the overall end user experience. So again, thank you very much to him for bringing this to my attention and sending it my way. But a big, huge thank you for all of you for staying tuned. It's been a wild couple of months, and I cannot wait to see what 2025 is going to continue to offer. So with that, thank you all very much for watching. And as always, I'll see you again next time. And a huge thank you to my Patreon providers and my Subscribe subscribers. Without you, this truly wouldn't be possible. If you'd like to support my channel but don't want to join either of those, I completely understand. But you could still help by using my affiliate links in the description below, and or like, share, and subscribe as always. Again, thank you very much.